Thank you. Let me make my way to the front. I've said it before, I will say it again. It is, of course, an honor and a deep pleasure and a privilege to me to have the opportunity to share just a few thoughts with you. And thoughts on a subject that is important. This whole subject of dying. But before I get to that, I had not anticipated that I might have to do this, but there's something I do need to get off of the table. That's an American expression. I don't know if it has much value here, but something I need to say just to clear the air. Since the last couple of days, it's been frequently remarked that I look a lot like someone. Because I've heard it more than once at this point, it seems to be some other fellow in America that I'm told that I look a lot like a fellow by the name of Barack Obama. So, while I do appreciate it, I do need to kind of clear the air in a couple of senses. First of all, I'm older than Barack Obama. So if anyone looks like anyone, talks like anyone, he's the one who looks and talks like me. All right? So you have the original here before you. Furthermore, although he is also the president of another organization, it is in fact a lesser one than the Theosophical Society, and he's only president of the United States. So let's get it straight now. All right, so having said that, now let's talk about this habit of dying. I don't often find myself quoting Deepak Chopra, but I will tonight. He said something that I think is quite profound about this whole subject of death. He described death as a terminal, incurable, sexually transmitted disease. Everybody gets it. There is no escaping. And so it's something that at some point in our consideration, it's something that we do need to give some attention to. It's one of those vital sorts of areas that we can walk around it, we can ignore it, but at some point it's to our benefit to give some sort of serious consideration to this topic. Every religion in the world has teachings specifically related to it. Literature, poetry, grandmothers' sayings, all encompass this subject because it's such a vital consideration. Shakespeare I don't remember which of his plays says, "Be absolute for death, for either death or life will be the sweeter for it." Go all in. So it's something that, again, we want to look at. So let me ask you a question. What is the opposite of death? What is the opposite of death? Life. Some say life. Birth. We tend to think that with this thing we describe as death, somehow life comes to an end. It's a mistaken idea. Birth is, in fact, the opposite of death, and both birth and death are events in the ongoing life that any and all live. Life is essentially unending, but it has many cycles and many incidents that occur during its course, death being one of them. For those who adopt some of the ageless wisdom point of view, which would say that there is, in fact, a reincarnating soul, a soul that is born repeatedly, then this is an event that has occurred to each and every one of us many, many times before, and will occur again. So the difficulty for us, though, is to come to grips with it now, during this one particular fragment during which we find ourselves conscious and active in this world. So probably we should ask a couple of questions. First of all, what is death? Just specifically at the level that we tend to describe it, which is the more, perhaps at a superficial level, it's a very specific thing that we describe as death, and it's a biological occurrence. Basically, the heart stops pumping at some point. When the heart stops, pretty soon the brain becomes starved for oxygen. And then when the brain shuts down, the pronouncement is made that this one is gone. But that's the way we look at it. We tie these things to the life and the movement of this body, but actually even at the point that we are described as dead, when the brain ceases to function, the heart's not working, there are activities within this body that continue. The digestion continues for at least 24 more hours. Your last supper will have time to be digested. It continues. The blood remains viable. 24 hours beyond that, the hair and the nails continue to grow. There is still a process of life of part of these components of the body that continue. But at some point, the disassociation of the soul element from the physical element results in the breakdown. The whole thing becomes disorganized and breaks down into its component parts. So that's what's going on with this actual process of death. And it's something that, again, in religious terms, there are many religions in the world that want to try and point our attention to this particular event, because it seems as if until we can get over it, we find ourselves stuck in many ways. I know particularly Tibetan Buddhist practice. They're very clever. I mean, they're very wise, but they're also very clever. And they will tell you things to think about. And particularly with this subject of death, they say there are 3 particular things they're going to ask you to think about. And you think about it for yourself and decide whether it's true or not. But you need to go through the process. So the first of these things that would be advised for us to think about, give some thought to, is the statement that everyone dies. And in that tradition, they'll say, think about it, ask yourself if it's true, and then you examine it. And in your own mind, you think, well, who do I know that hasn't died? And, the list gets pretty small pretty fast. In the U.S., I remember I mentioned this point to a group like this. I was talking about, think about it. Who has not died that you know of? And of course, there's nobody that we know of, but somebody's hand went up in the back. I know. And I really did want to hear who this was. And so I said, okay, well, share with us who it is. He says, oh, Elvis. Because he had just seen him in Las Vegas, apparently. But, those fictional. But otherwise, we ask ourselves this question of who it is that has died. And if you reason this thing through to its logical conclusion, you come to the conclusion that everybody arrives at this state. My grandmother's gone, my father's gone, all of their parents, Jesus is gone, Buddha died. So very likely it's something that might happen to me. All indications are that it will. So then they say the second thing they want you to think about is this, that the time at which it will occur, just like it is certain that it will occur, the time at which it will occur is uncertain. And again, you ask yourself whether or not this is true. I have thought, now, nobody asked me to contribute to this project, but I had thought that if it was up to me to design this whole birth and dying process, I would have done it differently. But as I say, nobody asked me. And so we're stuck with what we have, where the time that we can go could be any moment. We all know people who have left here very young. You say this person was much too young to die, but that's not true. At any moment, at any time, it could happen. But if it had been left to me, here's how it would have worked. At each person, on the day you were born, you would know that you would live till your birthday, 120 years later. And that during that time, it would give you the opportunity, if everyone knew that they had that 120 years, to plan a much better organized life. You know, the first 40 years would be party time or something like, you know, just sow wild oats indefinitely, you know, because you're 40 years, only 1/3 of your life. The next 40 years, you could start your household, raise a family, and do all of that. And then you could focus in this last period of life on the spiritual dimension of being. And then, you know, when the clock struck midnight on that day, you'd be ready. But as I say, nobody asked me. So we have a very, very different situation. So the fact that we're all going at some point is a fact. The fact that we really don't know when it will be is also something we can logically tell ourselves is quite true. I mean, all of us have been alive long enough to have witnessed this. So then the third thing that they ask, and really the important point of all of this consideration, is this third question, which is, at the time, at the moment that this passing occurs, that death does occur, what is it that will be of the most value to you at that moment? And again, you go through the logical process. You just don't take somebody's word on any of this. So you ask yourself, what would be of value? Okay, I have some money in the bank. No, I don't think that will be helpful at this moment. In the United States, they have this expression that you have never seen a Brinks truck following a funeral procession. Brinks truck, they're the ones who transport money to different businesses. But that obviously will not be something that is of use to us. So well, how about my friends? You know, I've had some good friends during my lifetime. Will that be of use to me at that moment? Actually, no. I mean, that's the very thing we're separating from all of this at that moment. Family, as much as, you know, we're loved, what can they do for us at that moment? And actually, when you get right down to it, the one and the only one that has been your friend through thick and thin, the only one that has been there with you through every moment of this journey, which is to say this very body, the only one that's been there for all of it, you're separating from that. So none of those things are of any value to you at that moment. So then what is? I mean, this is the question. What is of value at that moment? And what they would say would be the thing that would be an answer that would be worthy to the question would be that the only thing that will be of any value at this moment of passing is the spiritual realizations, not the teachings or the readings or the talks that you've heard, but the actual things that you've managed to realize and cultivate within you as an experience. That's what's of value at this moment, and only that. And so the exercise obviously is one that's, they walk us through this exercise with a specific point in mind. The idea is that after we have gone through this sort of consideration, and if we come out with answers that don't include Elvis or, eternal life in a body, then you start to think that, well, if all of this is true, then maybe I need to look at my priorities. And then this is where we have the opportunity to actually have an effect in this whole process. It's not a process that's out of our control. And this is the whole point of this line of thought. So what then, we've been talking a little bit about death, and I'm not going to really be spending a lot of time on death and the states thereafter, because to me, the more important aspect of it is something else, which is not death, but dying. Death is a biological process. Dying is a psychological process. It's one that relates to our emotional and our mental response to this fact that at some point the body's going to drop away. How do we, what is our emotional and mental response to that? There's a woman in the United States, was where she did most of her work. If I'm not mistaken, she was from Austria. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. But she did an awful lot of work. She was very early into this whole work with the dying. And one of the things she came up with was a 5 stages that she says people go through in this process of coming to grips with the fact of dying. 5 stages. And she listed them, and they were, the very first stage was, if you were to take the example of someone who walks into the doctor, on a sunny day and then gets that call. All of us are just a phone call away from something like this. Step into the doctor, phone call comes, oh, we've found something. You know how that can happen. And then someone gets the pronouncement that, you have 6 months to live or whatever it is. The first stage in this process is described as denial. It's too much to face, generally, this sort of newfound awareness of an immediate process. We always think we know it's coming, but we know it's down the road. But when it becomes very immediate, the first response is denial and isolation, is the way she describes it. We sort of close down the fort and try to come to grips with any of this. Next tends to be a response of anger. Why me? What type of universe is this that we live in that would permit something like this to happen? Why me? The response of anger. And these are normal sorts of responses to this sort of information. After that, she says that the next phase is a phase of bargaining. So it's, I will stop mistreating my sister if only this will be lifted from me. I will go to I haven't been going to church regularly. I will go to church if only, this. So there's a bargaining phase that we sort of go through. And if nothing changes at that phase, then the next phase she speaks about is a phase of depression, where hope is lost and people tend to go down. But there is this 5th phase, which is what she describes as acceptance, that actually is productive of probably one of the most beautiful stages in a person's life, if a person gets to that. I had the opportunity for a number of years, I was working in hospice care. And part of that care involved, sitting with people who were, 40-year-old who had weeks to live and, 60, 80, whatever it is, but hospice care. And it became something that I witnessed where it was almost a pattern that sometime within the last 2 weeks of a person's life, there was this occurrence of some very profound acceptance, not just of the fact that they're going to be going, but it was a very healing sort of acceptance that relationships that had been damaged over the course of a lifetime were healed. You know, people who they felt had done them wrong and they couldn't forgive no matter what. You know, they found a way to see it in a different light. It lost, the slight that had occurred somehow lost its importance in the face of something much grander that they saw ahead. Very often you could see a visible sort of it was almost a glowing sort of presence, a loving presence that would come out from them in this last phase. Beautiful time of life, really, when people had actually reached that. And so these are the phases that were described by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and that seemed to be relatively accurate. So one of the difficulties that we have in facing something like this is the fact that, in large measure, we haven't given it a lot of attention, and so we end up falling into a trap. Many of us, there are very few people these days who want to appear as if they're unscientific. I mean, it's sort of it's like saying you're somehow mentally deranged if you don't feel that you're completely in step with science as it's presented these days. You know, from the point of view of someone who has involved with the spiritual path, or you can see that there are very clear limitations in the scope of science today. The main one being that it, as yet, does not allow for the existence of consciousness. You know, the one thing that is the universal, it's present in every experiment, it's present in every experimenter. Everybody knows that they are conscious, but consciousness, because it can't be measured as yet, there's no instrument that can touch it, that can measure it, that can feel it. It can't be visibly seen. The only way it becomes apparent is through its effects. So, you know, you're aware that someone's conscious because they nod their head and move. But once the body stops moving, then the assumption from the scientific point of view is that there is no animating spirit, that basically it arose from the body itself. And so many people who have not necessarily had the sorts of inward experiences to tell them otherwise, accept, or at least have in the back of their mind, the possibility that it may all end. You know, when the body stops, it's all over. And, you know, that sets up certain kind of fears. And it's not, it's one of those things that's kind of difficult to deal with because it seems to be such a mystery. There's a story. There was a great spiritual master. And he always had his students, and they would ask him, about many things, and he would tell them about many things. And one of them was this subject of death. And he would always say that this death is an illusion. And you need to get over it. It's an illusion. It's not real. Consciousness survives. And so one day, the news came that this master's son had died. And so the students all looked to this master, and they found that he was sobbing uncontrollably. And they really started to think, yeah, okay, at first maybe yes, but it seemed a little bit unseemly to them that their master should continue all of this sobbing in the face of something he had trained them was an illusion. And so finally one of the students got up the nerve to go and just bring the subject up with him. And he went to him and he said, look, master, I hate to interrupt your crying. I see you're crying, but hadn't you always told us that death is an illusion? And so he wiped his eyes and nodded his head and said, yes, I said that, and it's true. He said, but it's the greatest of illusions. It is the greatest of illusions. So it's one of those things that no matter what our level, it's something that can affect us. So part of what happens, it seems, through this process of kind of protect ourselves from this essential fact of living, is that it sets up certain pathologies almost within us as a human family. I mean, you see certain things that you can see are this whole glorification of youth. You know, everywhere you look, it's like youth is what is portrayed as the natural, ongoing state that people want to be involved with. In fact, in the life of the Buddha, you know, there's that famous story how he was, when he was born, it was said that he was going to go in one of two ways. One would be that he would be a great ruler among human beings. He'd be a great ruler of a kingdom. And the other would be that he'd be a savior for humankind. His father, being a king, knew which way he preferred for his son to go. You know, he wanted to keep him in the family business of ruling the kingdom. And so he took pains to make sure that nothing took his son's mind away from this role that was ahead of him. So everything in the kingdom was always kept spotless, beautiful. There were no signs of anything but vibrant youth and vitality. An older person, someone like me, came into the court, I wouldn't be allowed in. Too much gray, too many wrinkles. So that was all that he was allowed to see for his entire time. But at some point, he wanted to go outside the walls and see the world around him. And this caused his father a lot of concern because, you know, this meant that he needed to, first of all, make sure that he only traveled down a certain pathway. He made sure that nobody was there that was dirty, that was unclean, that was old, that was ill. But sure enough, when he went out on his chariot, first time he goes out, he looks, and off to the side, he sees something he'd never seen before. It was someone who was, you know, sick and had sores on their body. And he asked his charioteer, what is that? Charioteer tells him, well, that's a sick person. So he says, that's a person? He says, yes. He says, well, will that happen to me? Of course it will. If you're a person, you'll get sick. Take me back to the castle. Second day he goes out, he sees someone bent over, you know, with a cane, graying, moving slowly. What's that? That's an old person. Well, will that happen to me? Of course it will, if you're lucky enough to live long. So he had taken back to the castle. The last day, it's a person he sees who has died. And again, the answer is yes, that will be you one day. So that's what set him on his course of trying to figure out really what it is that lies behind this wheel that keeps moving us through all of these cycles of sickness, old age, and death, and to try and get an answer. That's what stimulated him in that direction. So then we ask ourselves another question. And the question is, what is it that actually dies? Because this is where we start to become, this is where it starts to actually get to be a little bit meaningful in terms of what it is we can do. From the point of view of the ageless wisdom tradition, we function at many different levels, the body being just one of them. And there are other levels of consciousness that tend to inhabit this body while it's here. So what it is that dies, you could say, is the personality that dies. Threefold thing. Personality is the physical body, the personality is the emotional nature that associates with it, and the mind that associates with that. So in stages, that's what it is that passes. But our most concern tends to be with this actual bodily passing. So it's this personality that passes, but there's something else that remains. Something else that goes on, something else that continues in its growth, life after life after life. And the actual process that is involved. What is it that happens as we're actually going through the process? And I think there are a few things that happen. And if we take the point of view, if we view it from the point of view of consciousness, rather than the trials and ordeals of a body, it looks different. And I think one of the things that you witness is that gradually, like one by one, as this dying process takes place, each of the senses starts to close down. So, the ability to see dims. Our view of the world starts to dim. The ability to touch dims. Smell dims. Taste, of course. It's said that the last sense to go is the sense of hearing. And always it's advised that even though a person may be there and seems to be immobile but still alive, that they can hear you. And so oftentimes, people talk about continue speaking to the person, because the process, the visible aspects of the process, it starts to become much more internal. That basically the soul is withdrawing in its preparation to departing. And so sense by sense by sense, it closes down. The breathing gets fainter and fainter and fainter until there's no sign of breath. And then it's said that actually there is an inner breathing that takes place. It's not the sort of respiration that we see on the surface, but there's a respiration that's going on nonetheless. There still is the element of life energy associated. It says that the consciousness centers in the heart. So it withdraws from the limbs. No longer are we distracted by our sense of touch. No longer are we distracted by the many sights, and it withdraws and it becomes quite centered. And at that point, they talk about in the near-death experience world. And you have so many people now who have had near-death experiences. Actually, if you talk to the folks who are doing studies on that, they say that 1 in 8 people have had some sort of near-death experience. That's a lot. But there seem to be some similarities among all of them. People have this period of withdrawing from the outer body, and then there comes a point where they always talk about this life review. I mean, everybody talks about how there was a point at which the various incidents started to display themselves before them in a lifetime. I've talked with a lot of people who do healing sorts of work, like body-related sorts of therapy, like massage therapists, for instance. And there's this interesting experience that seems to be fairly common. Is there anyone here who does massage therapy or is where you're working on? Okay. So you tell me if this has ever happened in your experience, where you may be working on a person, working on a shoulder, a leg, some part of the body. And in working on the body, for some reason that has nothing to do with the pressure you're applying, suddenly the person becomes flooded with some sort of emotion, something that has happened to them, and there's a memory often associated with it. Oftentimes people tell me about working on someone, they were just massaging them in a normal way, and all of a sudden they just started sobbing uncontrollably. And somehow or another, a memory flooded them about something that had happened to them at some other stage in life. Is that something that's familiar to it? Okay, so everybody, this is confirmed. But oftentimes people speak about cellular memory or muscle memory, and they may use those terms to describe it, where somehow or another, some sort of often traumatic event, it is often related to deeply emotional sorts of events, they can't find full expression they can't be processed. Perhaps it's too much for someone to deal with, and it finds itself becoming stored somehow in some area of the body. And often it's an area that they end up having problems with. My shoulders are so stiff. But when that releases, when whatever it was that was causing this to become confined and locked is allowed to release, then these memories start to flood their awareness. And it's a similar process that happens with this life review. On another level, you have a similar example of this same sort of cellular or muscular memory on a planetary scale. It was fascinating to me when the Soviet Union broke down so quickly. The Soviet Union, like many countries, was an amalgamation of peoples, a variety of peoples, many who had had historic animosities. But during the lifetime of this overarching power, those animosities could be suppressed. But as soon as that suppression was lifted, you witnessed wars breaking out all over. And it's happened in many places where, in the absence of this suppression, then these sorts of hidden traumas start to reveal themselves. And for us, really, the greatest suppression that we face is the suppression of many of the aspects of our consciousness from what we routinely call our life. The fact that we are continually active through this body, through its senses, the fact that we are continually accepting and living out through a whole variety of identities as either people who are British, people who are male, female, Catholic, Theosophist. We have a variety of identities that we find ourselves living through. And as the suppression, as they cease to lock up this energy of a soul that is essentially without gender or nationality, religion, then some of that is allowed to come out. And so at this moment where these visions of the life that has just been lived start to appear, this is this process of decompressing. Bit by bit by bit, the things that have weighted these memories down, that have hidden them from consciousness, becomes removed. And then there's this expansive view of the life that has been lived. And you view it for all of its benefits, and you view it from where maybe you didn't measure up. But you view it, almost for the first time. And so this is the reports of people who come, to the portal and then come back to tell about it. It's near death because they're still here. It's not all the way. So, this is what happens during this process. But the more important thing we have to ask ourselves, if we consider all of this, and if we accept that this is something that, we're on a pathway toward this, what can we do about any of this? I mean, during the whole time that I've been talking, it's one of these subjects that is, you can approach it in a lot of ways. It's not intended to be approached as a morbid thing, but very often the response to it is, and then it even gets to, and then sometimes, which is understandable, because it's one of those push-button sorts of subjects. But the fact of the matter is this, that with this, as with all things, during the course of this lifetime, we die many times. And this last one is not the most bitter one. Anyone who's lost a job knows the feeling of profound loss of something that, of myself that has been experienced, who's lost a loved one. That's the saying is, it's a terrible thing to love that which death can touch. It's a terrible, but it's a necessary thing. So what do we do? Socrates, many considered a wise man, he spoke about philosophy as being the daily practice of death. I mean, what does that mean? Again, for me, I think the key point and the key experience, the opportunity that is provided in any of these moments where something drops away from us, is that it opens a horizon that was previously obscured. I think Ted this morning was talking about how, he was talking about in terms of astrological cycles, how during the course of a person's life, there'll be times when you're so busy doing the things that are so important and so meaningful, and then somehow or another there'll be another turn in the cycle, and for whatever reason, those things are taken away from you. And then you find yourself saying, well, why me? He says, well, maybe it's an opportunity for something. And in that case, it was, well, yeah, now I have time to study. Now I have time to meditate, because everything else has kind of been taken away temporarily. So for us, there is the possibility to root ourselves more deeply in what we could call our essential nature. Very often I think that this whole spiritual path, people talk about their attraction to Theosophy or their attraction to different sorts of spiritual paths. And oftentimes they find themselves looking up to others who seem to be much more profound, the experts in spirituality. But I really do believe that the fact of the matter for all of us is that every one of us, anyone who finds themselves at all attracted to something like Theosophy or any other spiritual path, it's because of something, an experience, a profound experience that's already a part of their being. And everybody has that. We often overlook it because I don't think very often we value these things rightly. I mean, anybody that I know has had the experience of, on some lovely British day, standing on your porch or standing looking out the window as the sun goes down in the western sky, and finding yourself somehow so, for whatever reason or no reason at all, just so caught up in this moment of beauty that for a moment, and oftentimes it's just a moment, the beauty of it, the splendor, the power of it is so profound that for a moment we cease to think about what it is we have to do next. We cease to think about the food that might be cooking on the stove. We cease to think about ourselves. And in that moment of becoming unselfed, looking back at it, because in that moment we don't think that way, but when we look back at it, we tell ourselves something like, in that moment, I was happy. In that moment, I felt peace. But basically what happens is, in that moment, for just a moment, we are no longer so tightly tied to this nest of identities that seem to suppress this very experience in us from moment to moment. We all have had things like this. Or watching a child take its first step, or watching children at play. Easy to just get lost in that. So these things happen. We don't necessarily think of it as a profoundly spiritual experience, but it is. Basically, from a theosophical point of view, it's the descent of the intuition, the descent of Buddhi, shining on the mind in that quiet moment when the clouds no longer block its shining. So this is a common experience. And these are things that can be recognized. During the course of our day, if we would spend as much time trying to notice these quiet points that can appear, rather than the many other ways we use our attentive powers. Noticing the things that disturb me about this person, or this place, or these other peoples. So this noticing process is something that we can do from moment to moment. The idea is also expressed that, to a certain degree, in our preparation for this much fuller way of living, that we need to try and reduce our attachments to things. It's good to like things, it's good to love things, but to feel as if we can't live without them is a mistaken idea. I mean, all of this consideration we've talked about speaks to that. So reducing our attachments, noticing those moments that break through, just like the sun breaks through a cloudy day, noticing when they appear and how they appear, and trying to strengthen those. All of these things are simple ways that we can prepare. And all of these things are ways that we can be as philosophical as Socrates, from moment to moment, from day to day, actually taking on our role in this habit. We've done it a bunch of times, this habit of dying. So I think that's about what I have for you tonight. So thank you. I thank you for your attention.